What is up, Tube users, and welcome back to another installment of Overwatch 2 Heroes, an in-depth guide. Today, we are talking about one of the most generic heroes in the game, but is honestly pretty fun to play, and that is Soldier 76. Let's get right into it and talk about Soldier's primary fire. Soldier 76's primary fire is Heavy Pulse Rifle. This is a hit scan assault rifle that deals 19 to 6 damage depending on the range. The fall off for this weapon begins at 30 meters and reaches its minimum damage at 50 meters. The rate of fire for this weapon is fairly quick at 9 rounds per second. While this weapon is hit scan, it does have recoil if fired continuously. The recoil for this weapon is pretty minimal, however, and is only tough to control if you're going for consistent headshot damage on an enemy. Now, let's move on to talk about Soldier's secondary fire. Soldier 76's secondary fire is Helix Rocket. This is a precision projectile that does an area of effect damage. A direct hit on an enemy deals 40 damage, plus an additional 80 to 40 splash damage to anyone within range. The range for the splash damage is pretty small at only 3 meters, however, from the explosion. The explosion also does knockback to enemies and Soldier 76 himself if he's in range of the explosion. A couple things to note about this ability is since it's an area of effect projectile, it cannot deal bonus headshot damage to enemies. Another thing to note is that if Helix Rocket passes through an allied amplification matrix, all the damage will be amplified. However, if only the splash damage is stealth, that damage won't be amplified. Another thing to note, if Soldier does take damage from his own Helix Rocket, the damage is only halved. Now, let's talk about Soldier's first ability. Soldier 76's first ability is Sprint. This is a pretty generic first-person shooter ability that allows Soldier 76 to sprint at a 50% increased movement speed. While generic, it does allow Soldier to get in the fight quicker with its unlimited duration and no cooldown once the ability is cancelled. This ability also only affects forward movement, so unfortunately Soldier 76 cannot sprint backwards. One thing to keep in mind with this ability is there's a small recovery time of 0.3 seconds once this ability is cancelled to fire his primary and secondary fire. Now, let's go over Soldier 76's next ability. Soldier 76's second ability is Biotic View. This is an area of effect healing station that heals Soldier and allies within its radius for 40 HP per second. The radius for this ability is 4.5 meters. This ability only lasts for 5 seconds. A couple of interesting things to note about this ability is it does have a small cast time of 0.5 seconds, but even if Soldier is stunned during that time, the ability will still go off. This ability cannot be destroyed by any means either. The cooldown for this ability immediately starts after activation, so there's only a 10-second window of downtime technically. The healing for this is affected by line of sight, but is not affected by enemy barriers. Now, let's move on to talk about Soldier's ultimate ability. Soldier 76's ultimate ability is Tactical Visor. This gives Soldier 76 aim hacks with his primary fire, auto-locking onto enemies within line of sight. This ability lasts for 6 seconds. A few key things to note about this ability is once active, Soldier's primary fire ammo is instantly replenished and the reload time for it is greatly reduced to just over half a second to reload. While the auto lock for this ability only tracks enemies' center of mass, you can aim towards the head to get headshot damage on locked targets. This ability will also target certain enemy abilities such as Ash's Bob, Junkrat's Riptire, and Baptiste Immortality Field, to name a few. Also, Soldier won't lock onto enemies behind their barriers. Now, with all of his abilities out of the way, let's dive into some heroes that counter and are countered by Soldier 76. While he does feel and play like a generic first-person shooter character, Soldier 76 is an all-around pretty decent hero, providing decent damage and great movement because of his sprint. He's honestly pretty decent against most tank heroes, but if I were to pick one, I'd go with Roadhog. Roadhog is just such a big target that it's pretty easy to land primary and secondary fire shots on him. Plus, with his sprint, it can be pretty easy to dodge Roadhog's hooks and get away from him if he's too close. As for a DPS hero Soldier plays well against, I'm going to go with Pharah. Being that Soldier's primary fire is a hit scan that can deal decent damage from range, he's one of the best heroes to deal with a flying Pharah. As for a support hero Soldier matches up well against, I'm going to go with Mercy. Mercy relies a lot on her movement to avoid enemy fire, but with Soldier's hit scan fire, he can deal some serious damage to a flying Mercy, easier than most heroes can. Now, let's look at the flip side of things and talk about heroes that counter Soldier 76. While Soldier's movement and damage is pretty good, he lacks any sort of strafing ability and can be susceptible to flankers and dives. As for a tank hero that plays well against Soldier, I'm going to go with Doomfist. While definitely not the easiest hero to master, Doomfist does a great job of getting behind an enemy soldier, and with his knockback from his punch, he can pretty easily knock a soldier out of range of his healing station, making him pretty vulnerable. A DPS hero that plays well against Soldier is Sojourn. Sojourn is quite similar to Soldier 76 in a lot of ways, but with higher burst potential and better escapability in my opinion. While I wouldn't say it's a direct counter, playing against an enemy soldier can be a nightmare for Soldier 76 because of that burst potential. Finally, a support hero that plays well against Soldier 76 is Ana. With her hit scan primary fire being able to do a lot more damage from range than Soldier, and her anti-heal nade being able to shut down most of the uptime for Soldier 76's healing station, this matchup is not favorable for Soldier 76. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into some tips and tricks for Soldier. Soldier 76 is probably the best hero for people starting out in this game who are coming over from basically any other first-person shooter. His just assault rifle and sprint capabilities just makes it feel like you're playing like a Call of Duty or Apex Legends or any of those games, so it's really easy to get in and understand how this character works. One thing I slept on for a long time is using Soldier 76's Helix rocket on himself to get some upward mobility. He does have really good forward mobility. He lacks any sort of way to get up and down places. So using that Helix rocket to just get a little bit of boost to places you normally wouldn't be able to can be a really good way to catch enemies off guard. Because of his high movement with his sprint and just having it be an unlimited resource, he is such a good person for flanking enemies. Just being able to target different lines of sight quickly is a really good way to play Soldier. Just peeking out one place, sprinting over to a different line of sight for enemies, and peeking out there and poking out damage can be really helpful to just catch enemies off guard. Typically, for his healing station, I like to use it right before I'm about to engage. Obviously, if you're taking a lot of damage, you want to try and heal yourself if you're not getting any healing from your supports. But if you know you're going to engage in a fight with enemies, it's good to just have that down, just so you'll have some healing throughput to any damage that you might be taking. And I mean, the healing station is also a good way to just heal allies since it has a pretty big radius and it does a good amount of healing per second. It can be just a good way after a team fight or even in a team fight to just heal allies around you. If you're healing a bunch of allies, it will give you a lot of ult charge as well. Speaking of ultimates, Soldier's tactical visor can be a little tricky to use just because of how the auto lock works, but you do want to try and aim for the head when you're locking onto enemies. So mainly when you use it, it will target the center of mass of heroes, which means pretty much like the middle of their body. And then you just have to aim slightly upwards in order to hit their head, which you can do pretty more consistently, I would say, than just firing normally, but it still can be kind of janky to use when first playing Soldier 76. And because his ultimate replenishes your ammos, you want to try and dump a full clip before using your ultimate. Although it does take, like, I think it's like over a second for the cast time of your ultimate to go into place. You just kind of want to use as much ammo so you get that instant reload and your attack visor is ready to go. Another thing to note about his ultimate is because you're locking onto enemies' bodies, it won't technically be guaranteed damage because his primary fire is a hit scan. That's usually guaranteed damage on a locked target, but you can fire your helix rocket while you are using your ultimate. So if they don't move, if the enemies are close enough and they don't move, they'll get hit by the helix rocket, which can do some serious burst damage to enemies. But yeah, I think that's all the tips and tricks I have for you today. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed. Comment any other tips and tricks you have for Soldier 76. And definitely make sure to subscribe. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.
That rhythm.